The most flung advice that I had at that time in my face was suck it up, man.
One of the questions that I sometimes get or I ask myself is, helping two people, is that enough when you've got millions? Now again, each leader has to figure out
What is signal, what is noise?
what is signal and what is noise.
Hi, my name is Jayakumar Hariharan. I'm an executive coach, speaker, and author. Stories That Shift is a series of intimate and up-close conversations with CXOs and practitioners of various disciplines about what makes them tick. Stories are not what we say. Stories are who we are. And in this edition of the podcast, I have a very special guest, Deepak Jayaraman. Deepak, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Jay.
Deepak, just for the sake of context, so that people who are tuning in, who are watching in, what is it you do?
So I work as a sounding board for leaders. That's sort of the one-line answer in the professional context, which basically means that I spend time understanding the full context of a leader's life, both on the business front and the family front, and then walk the path with them, acting as a sounding board. When I say sounding board, it's sort of some intersection of four circles. The business, their life, the communities they live in, and some of the leadership challenges. So it's sort of, if you look at a Venn diagram, in different cases, different circles would intersect. But really, sometimes it might be, should I hire this person? Sometimes it might be, how do I get better at this? Sometimes it might be, I have this culture issue at work. So just being a sounding board after having understood their full context. So that's what I do professionally.
Amazing. From a typical executive coaching standpoint, as a fellow practitioner, what I've also been led to believe is a sounding board is one slice of the various things that an executive coach brings to the table, but you think of that as a forefront. I'm curious about that.
I think I don't want to get lost in semantics. Different people interpret coaching to mean different things.
Right.
But I think it's about building trust. Sometimes it's about, and sometimes people finesse about, is this mentoring, is it coaching, is it guiding, is it advising? And I, again, don't want to get lost in the semantics. It's trying to be of value. Sometimes you ask them the question, which is sort of the coaching approach, to help them figure out the answer. Sometimes you're a little more prescriptive because you've seen that situation before, and so on and so forth. So really, one at least thing I bear in mind is focus on value and not so much on the how you do it, whether it's a question or a suggestion.
Nice.
Because otherwise the purists might say a coach is only supposed to ask questions, should not recommend. And I get why it's that way. So I don't obsess about the how, but sort of the end objective, which is, am I adding value? Second is, I try and ensure that I look at the entire human being. I look at the professional, I look at the father or the mother, the sibling, the child, the member of the community, and try and help them unlock their full potential. And of course, one could say, how is this different from life coaching? Now, I don't know enough about what is life coaching because at the end of the day, everything, if you say you're doing a life coaching thing, then you're doing everything. So again, it's a semantic issue, but broadly, I would say primary focus is value creation and sort of creating a space where the person can discuss their innermost challenges and opportunities with somebody.
I think it's so liberating, the process that you've kind of adopted, focusing on the end objective rather than pass words and figure out, is this what it is meant to be, or is this what I'm supposed to be doing? Is this what other people are doing? I think that's beautiful. That's amazing. And so liberating. Fantastic.
And the other point, if I may make, is I've begun to focus on journeys than interventions. Sometimes coaching can come in a 6-month, 9-month kind of a journey. But I try and say, if I'm working with somebody, I stay the path for a year, 2, 3, and so on. At least that's the perspective I'm beginning to take. I'm also evolving as I go through my journey. But that's the other distinction I see. Sort of really multi-year journeys where only as the cumulative context and the cumulative trust increases, then your ability to be of value becomes that much more nuanced and that much more possible.
Deepak, this is a very interesting one because I get asked this question quite a bit. How did you find this practice or journey from your earlier formative careers? I'm curious to know that story.
How did I get here?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I wish there was a straight line. It's a sort of quite a wavy path. I think it's a sequence of things, Jay. For a long time, I kept telling myself, given my background, problem solving is my sort of the thing that I should be doing. So that took me to management consulting in KPMG and subsequently at McKinsey. I was in McKinsey, New Jersey. I came to India in 2008 in the context of a personal crisis, if I may. My father had been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, so I had to come and take care of his treatment. 6 months, unfortunately, he passed away. We could only palliate, we could not cure. But when it was time for me to go back, Lehman had happened. The world economy was going through a slow patch. And going back to the US, both from a personal and professional standpoint, didn't make sense. So my wife and I decided to take stock and do a reboot in India. She was kind enough, she was pursuing a career in not-for-profit in New York. So she was kind enough to suspend that and say, let's start in India. Around that time, one of my mentors in McKinsey said, have you thought of executive search? You seem to have a knack for the people side of things. In McKinsey, the consultants would often be evaluated on 3 fronts: IQ, CQ, and RQ. IQ is the intellect, your problem-solving horsepower. CQ is the toolkit of a consultant, your ability to sort of write good slides, storyboard, etc., etc. RQ is a relationship quotient, and every consultant would typically spike on 1 out of the 3.
I hear you.
I was spiking on the 3rd. But he was the one that looked at that. I knew that, but he was the one that said, why don't you double down on that and have you thought of executive search? So he said that's also client services at the highest level and you're spending more time on people-related stuff. So he introduced me to a couple of consultants at Egon Zehnder. One is a gentleman called Govind Iyer, who is a friend and a mentor. One thing led to another and I joined executive search in 2010. 3 years there, I was enjoying my role. I made principal, which is on the path to partnership and so on. Around the time, one of my feedback conversations, Govind, who was the office managing partner at that time, said, tell me what were the 2 high points last year. A search consultant who's enjoying the profession would typically say, when I placed the CEO or when I won this mandate. I remember telling him what brought me the most joy was actually these 2 career counseling conversations with a candidate. And they later wrote me a note saying, thank you. That chat really, changed my perspective. Now Govind looked me in the eye and said, that's fantastic, but that's not how we do business. That's not what puts bread on the table. So I think I was beginning to realize that what gave me joy was slightly different from the commercial engine of the organization. So I think around that time I met a friend of mine and I narrated this incident and he said, yeah, that makes sense. You seem to have more of a coaching mindset than a poaching mindset. So I think sometimes, feedback comes from the most interesting of places. So to me, that was like a penny drop moment. I said, okay, it's not a skill set issue. Of course, I would say I was a middling search consultant. I'd made principal, but I would say I was not hitting it out of the park. But I also realized that there was a dissonance at a mindset level. I enjoyed spending more time helping people and less time evaluating people. While in search, it's like sitting on like a Shark Tank judge, right? People are coming and pitching to you. Candidates are coming and pitching to you, and your job is to discern quality. It's a heady feeling, but I realized that did not give me joy. So Govind again at that time was kind enough and said, why don't you consider being certified as a coach and doing leadership advisory within the organization? But that's around the time I had my second child, who's now 9 years old. And I think I was also looking for greater work-life harmony. And I realized that if I work in a professional services firm, somebody else is going to set the pace of my treadmill. So I said, my race, my pace. So that's another reason why I decided to do this kind of leadership advisory work, but on my own terms. So I set up my own practice about 7 years back. So that's sort of the long and short of how I got here.
Fascinating. Would you call this a confluence of various events, interesting pivots in your journey? Or is there a particular trigger that you can vividly recall?
I think it's a sequence of triggers, Jay. As I said, that trigger by this individual, Ramesh Mangaleshwaran, who was a director at McKinsey, who said, why don't you double down on RQ, and him making the connect to Egon Zehnder. So that pathway was in my blind spot at that time. 3 months before that point, if you'd asked me, I would have said, yeah, I'm looking for a job in a venture capital or a PE or a strategic planning role. So that opened up that pathway, and I walked Egon Zehnder. So I think this feedback from Govind, coupled with this sort of friend sort of doubling down on that feedback and making the point about poaching, I think that was a second. I think the last point I should mention is, when I set out, I wasn't sure if this would be a commercially feasible path.
Gotcha.
Right? Given that I'd been in environments where it was reasonably remunerative, and that's where again my wife was kind enough to say, let's keep our cost base low. And we both come from middle class backgrounds, right? Her father is a retired army officer. My father worked in a public sector bank. So we said, let's keep our costs low. Let's see how it goes for 18 months, and then if it doesn't go well, plan B, I'll come back to some other treadmill and start running. If not, we'll see how this goes. So I think I must also give credit to the role she played in me trying this.
Amazing. I'm sure you will go home a happy man when she listens to this podcast.
Thank you.
No, but it's really, really sweet of you to acknowledge some of the best and closest stakeholders that we have. And sometimes in the hurly-burly of everyday things, we somehow kind of relegate that to an extent. And I think that's beautiful. And disarming humility in calling it for what it is. You said you were middling. You were not hitting it out of the park as a search consultant. That's grace, Deepak.
I think, let me expand on that, right? See, in a search consultant's journey, there is a front end of the search is about getting the right search strategy, figuring out where the candidate will come, making a few calls, talking to them, lining up good candidates, etc., etc. It feels a lot like consulting. A lot of people have told me that. But the back end of search feels a lot like investment banking, where you've got a deal to close, you've got to hustle on the candidate side, you've got to hustle on the client side, and that requires a slightly different set of muscles.
Sure.
You need a certain negotiation and influencing capability. You need to sometimes candidates can be funny, they can sort of play ball. You need to know when to push back. Now, those are things both from a skill and a will perspective I felt I didn't have. So I think I was okay. On the front end, I would have given myself a A-. On the back end, I would have given myself a B+.
Gotcha. I think that distinction was, I kind of figured that out, but I think that distinction was really important. Amazing. What a journey. Deepak, it's a conundrum that organizations and individuals, especially senior leaders, when they have a little bit of a conflict of interest, in the sense that where they really come alive, where they play to their potential, is not often where the organization derives its value. And for people who are willing to or want to make peace with that, either which way, what are the steps that you would suggest them to walk on to arrive at that decision in a much more harmonious manner?
Great question, Jay. I think I found myself in that place some time back, right, about 7-8 years back. I think step one, I would say, is see if there's a values dissonance, right? In my case, at least, I found that there was a strong resonance in the values between Egon Zehnder and me. Excellence, client first, collaboration, things that were very close to my heart. So I didn't feel any dissonance there. So one, I said test for that. Second, I would say see if it's a short-term problem. Sometimes we often find ourselves in roles which is often a bridge role, or it's a pathway to something else. Or sometimes you might have a boss or a colleague who sometimes has a disproportionate impact, negative impact on how we experience a situation. See if, again, some of that is contributing to the short term. You don't want to sort of do something silly because of a short-term trigger. Yep. And finally, I would say, see if you can experiment around the edges. One of the themes I find value in is this notion of adjacent possible. There's a term I picked up in a book by a gentleman called Cal Newport. He's written a lovely book called So Good They Can't Ignore You. And he says that sometimes
Has he also written deep work?
He has.
Oh,
the
great.
one before that was So Good They Can't Ignore You. And one of the things he says, he's very often if we don't find fish in a certain pond, we try and go to a very different river and start fishing. He says, try and go to the adjacent pond.
Nice.
Nice. So sometimes I find that people swing too far. And sometimes the answer might lie either in a separate BU in a nearby or a different office or a different, maybe the culture, if there's a culture issue, maybe it's that particular office. Maybe you change location. So try and see if you can minimize disruption. One of the things I say as a student of transitions is try and minimize the number of vectors around which you're transitioning at a point in time. Don't change too many things. So try and find a solution space within the same organization if you can. If you can't, then I guess, once again, I don't want to make it as a blanket statement, right? Sometimes you have commercial pressures. I might say, look out, but if you need that salary, then you might just want to suck it up. So I think it's heavily contextual. It's hard to prescribe, but at least exhaust the solution space within the current canvas before you start looking out. Is maybe the last point I forgot to mention is learning. Sometimes the learning curve tapers. See if there's a project you can run which can introduce you to new stakeholders and maybe also in a way open up opportunities for future career pathways. So sorry, a hodgepodge of ideas, but some of
Not at all. In fact, I was thinking that is such a strategic, well thought out way. Where were you 12 years ago? Because, as somebody who's been in that space, I've grappled with the challenge that I just posited as a question to you. And it is a fairly lonely moment at that time. And it's a very hard moment. And you somehow get into a shell that the world doesn't seem to know where you're coming from or is not willing to accept it. And the most flung advice that I had at that time in my face was, suck it up, man. Everybody's got their own stuff going. And look, you want to put bread on the table, and a job is a route to achieve that. So at some point in time, you just have to make peace with elements that you can't control or that elements that you're not completely in sync with. And I found that to be maybe true, but a tad harsh and a bit cynical. And hearing you just now, beautifully, very, very well laid out, saying that you don't have to suffer. You don't have to go through it all alone. There are things that you could consider when you're going through a conundrum of that nature.
The other thing, if I may add, is you said harsh and cynical. I think the third I would say is also impersonal. And the point I mention is only you know your journey. When I was at Egon Zehnder, a lot of people would say, you've got this ticket. So ride the train. So why would you buy the ticket and get off the train, right? Which makes sense from their perspective. But I know my life and I know what I care about that the other person doesn't know. So sometimes I think it's also about being true to what you care about, and it's okay. I mean, the other person is coming from their vantage point and from what they care about. And even if they're a well-wisher, sometimes they may not see what you're experiencing and what you're feeling. So while being pragmatic, I think it's also about listening to that inner voice in terms of what matters to you, I feel.
I think that's very beautiful. Let me throw a couple of other euphemisms that came our way. Don't kick a gift horse in its mouth. Other people will give their eye teeth for the job you have.
Correct.
And so on.
The movie that left a mark on me in this context, Jay, is a movie called Good Will Hunting.
Beautiful.
Right. So
and a side note to my colleague Anoksha, you should watch this movie.
Yeah, it's a movie where you have a gifted mathematician who could have taken many jobs, including the NASA and this and that, but finally he decides to pursue his love interest. So finally, we all have that love interest, whatever that might be.
Because it's very uncanny that you bring that up, because that's one of my all-time favorites. The amount of trivia that I've dug up about the movie, because it influenced me so much, is just amazing. It's just like loaded with so many stories about that movie. And I still think that it gives you a glimpse into the mind of a tortured genius, and how a well-meaning practitioner helps him deal with that. Yes. I think it was just beautiful. And a quick trivia, since I'm a movie buff, apparently the last line, Robin Williams gave 20 takes, and all the 20 takes were different.
I've got to see about that girl.
I've got to see about that girl.
We could spend the rest of this conversation discussing Good Will Hunting.
It's beautiful. And, a very, very quick thing about decision making that I talk about is apparently Matt Damon and Ben Affleck, they suddenly realized they were hot property because of the script. They sent it to about 12 studios, and everybody said, yeah, yes, we're interested. But knowing these guys believed in script integrity to such a point, they wanted to be very sure that they were dealing with the right partner. And finally, they signed with Miramax, when Harvey was still not Harvey, the Harvey we know, but it was a much better firm. And the reason they signed in was he was the only studio head who called up, he or somebody from his firm called up and said, I love the script, but what is happening on page 120? Why is there a gay scene between these two protagonists? So they've done what David Lee Roth of Van Halen kind of did, which is they put not a red herring, they put like a splotch where
M&Ms, 6 M&Ms.
6 M&Ms, yeah, no brown M&Ms. So they put it there saying that we will work with you, but you got to give us a grace to have read the script completely end to end. And they were the only people who came back and said, and they said, this is the firm for us.
Very interesting. I wasn't aware of this.
There's so much of this thing about it. And it's beautiful. Anyway, Goodwill Hunting fan club, India fan club presidents.
You should start a separate series of conversations on Goodwill Hunting.
Which also... brings me to my next question, right? Would you want to talk about your podcast? And for viewers and for listeners, Play to Potential is often my go-to source for leadership wisdom in the podcast space, purely because of two things. One is Deepak's grace in ensuring that the guests are really comfortable and his skill in asking the questions. It was almost like at one point in time, I'm like, how does Deepak know what's the question I had in mind? And that is complete simpatico. That is beautiful. The second thing is the kind of practitioners that he gets from around the globe. I've learned a lot. So Play to Potential is definitely a place that you should check it out. It's available everywhere. So my question to you, Deepak, is how did Play to Potential come about? And what talk us through that journey?
Hey, thank you. Thank you for the kind words. It's a learning journey for me as well, Jay. Where did it come from? I think two, three things happened, right? One is I read a very inspiring book by a guy called Brian Grazer, who's made movies like Beautiful Mind and Apollo 13. So the crux of the book, Curious Mind, is he says, I end up having curiosity conversations with different sets of people. One day I'll meet an astronaut, one day I'll meet a biophysics guy, one day I'll meet a forester and so on, and eventually these dots connect and movie plots form, right? He said that's how the sort of the inspiration for Beautiful Mind and Apollo 13 came. So somewhere I felt there was, when I moved on from Egon Zehnder, I had to find a way of being curious and going on a series of conversations. Around that time, some people reached out to me and said, why don't you be a speaker? Why don't you become a motivational speaker? And the metaphor I use is becoming a motivational speaker is a bit like giving a missed catch. I can only give a catch. Whether you miss it or take it is in your hands.
Gotcha.
So I can only be a speaker. Whether you get motivated or not is not in my hands, it's in your hand.
Gotcha.
I can be a motivated speaker, but I don't know what is a motivational speaker.
Nice distinction.
So I said that somehow felt inauthentic. I also felt there was a lot for me to learn and evolve. So I decided to be a seeker and not a speaker. So that was one call. And that's around the time I read Brian Grazer's book. Second thing I realized is somehow I had this habit of synthesizing information and making sense. For example, I was the kid in class whose notes would get photocopied the previous day.
Wow.
So I may not be the topper of the class, but I would take good notes. Someone else might take those notes and go on top, but that's okay. I've done my bit in enabling that person to play to his or her potential.
Awesome.
Second is, for example, I used to read books. When I read Curious Mind, for example, I made a 7-page synthesis of the book and created a PDF, and I sort of sent it to people. I found that synthesizing came naturally to me for my learning. I call it L&D, learn and distribute. So I learn as the primary objective, then I distribute for a common objective. The third sort of borderline silly example is around 2000 when I was in the UK with KPMG for a couple of years. I decided to learn ball juggling. We'd gone to Covent Garden for a circus, circling performance, and I saw a bunch of jugglers. for some reason, just in that moment, went up to the guy saying, "Yeah, I love what you do. I'd love to learn juggling." So he had a shop in a place called Camden Town in London.
Yeah.
Sort of a dodgy part of town, actually, where the average piercing per person is like 2.5. Right? So it's that kind of a suburb of London. So I would show up. I went one weekend to his shop. This was a shop called Oddballs,
Aptly named.
And they sort of sell juggling equipment, all kinds of clubs and this thing, rings and whatever. So he gave me 3 bean bags and said, "Here's how you do the basic pattern, which is called a 3-ball cascade. 3-ball cascade is the basic juggling pattern." So he said, "Why don't you practice this and come? I'll give you the next lesson after you've figured this out." And he also gave me a book called Encyclopedia of Ball Juggling by a guy called Charlie Dancy.
Wow.
It was like a lovely book with illustrations and whatever. So I spent the next 2-3 weeks really figuring out the 3-ball cascade, and with a lot of effort, I sort of got a hang of it, and then I went to a shop again. Then he gave me the next lesson, so something called 2 in 1 hand. Then whatever, trick after trick after trick. So I did that for a period of about 12 months actually. Each juggling trick is almost like a 0 to 1 journey. It's like learning to, it's like cycling anew. It's almost like swimming. You learn freestyle, then you start the breaststroke. It's almost like you start sinking again.
Absolutely.
It's a fresh effort. When I came back to India, I said, "Yeah, I've learned juggling." And I realized that there's a lot of benefit in terms of hand-eye coordination, focus and muscle memory and so on. So I said, I want the kids to learn it. So I went and did a video shoot in one of the video parlors of Andheri. I remember going to the guy saying, "Yaar, mujhe video banana hai." And his normal customer would come and say, "Shadi hai, aa jao." So he said, "Kis cheez ka?" "Juggling." So the guy says, "Juggling kya hota hai?" So whatever I had to explain, then I went and, we created a backdrop, and it's still on YouTube. It's called
How fascinating is this?
Introduction to Juggling 101. Those were the days where I had more hair. No, I think the point I was making was I felt there was this content creation kida, if I may, which was in me. So I think it's a combination of going on a seeking journey, coupled with a desire to create some sort of content. I would say the last trigger came from an unexpected place. I'd gone to IIM, my alma mater, to meet the director at that time, a gentleman called Ashish Nanda, who now teaches at Harvard. He just spent 15 minutes with me, but I think it was a very provocative 15 minutes. He told me, and he's an expert in professional services organizations. He conducts courses for leaders of professional services organizations on how they can build their own organization. So he looked at me and said, when you belong to a large services organization like a McKinsey or an Egon Zehnder, you take for granted that you're standing on a big platform. Of course, you've got the calling card. People take your call when you call from an Egon Zehnder or McKinsey. But he said, what you don't appreciate enough is that the platform does the hard work of replenishing itself. There's somebody sitting in London or New York who's doing the research on the latest search methodology or a psychometric to ensure that you're able to do your job well. So there's an R&D function somewhere that's enabling your ops function here. So I think the crux of the input from him was, if you just become a practitioner and focus on the ops, then you'd be surprised at how quickly the curve depreciates. So somewhere I think that was also a useful provocation for me to say, I need to have some sort of a R&D, L&D kind of a function which ensures that I stay relevant and I keep replenishing myself. So I would say it was a confluence of some of these factors that led me to starting the podcast.
Fascinating. And what's more interesting is this was 6 years ago. How many podcasts were there?
At that time, and again, it's not because I knew this podcasting would be the next big thing. It was just me trying to keep the costs low. At that time, the default suggestion was get onto YouTube, start doing videos. But I realized that if I have to get the production value, then I can't, pardon my French, half-ass it.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
I had to really either go all the way. But I said podcast, I felt, gave the delta intimacy without the delta cost.
Brilliant.
That's the way I saw the trade-off. And also I realized that if I have to talk to people in other time zones, I might be well-dressed, but the other person might be in the pajamas, in their pajamas, right?
Sure.
So podcast takes all that awkwardness away.
Absolutely.
You just, the person just gets up from bed, has a coffee and has a chat with you. And it's the listener doesn't know.
Absolutely.
Or vice versa. So I think those were the two big, that's the reason I went into podcasts. And of course, subsequently, I think it's become it was already a reasonably big thing in the US. I think in India, it hadn't caught on.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Beautiful. I'm definitely going to leave this conversation a much wiser man, because I realize there is an encyclopedia for juggling.
Yes.
How fascinating is
Charlie
that?
Dancy.
This is clearly you march to the beat of a very different drummer, because if you not only, it's nice to walk up to somebody who's practicing an arcane, very interesting offbeat kind of a thing, but I'm sure it's so far away from, what you would construe as enjoyment per se, but for you to last the course. And that's what I found really fascinating. It's nice to just go and dabble in something and say, oh, okay, this is it for me. And, I had fun, I had a good time and come back. But for you to actually, I guess that's why you use the word seeker. And I think that's such a powerful word, right? And, which is what comes out in all the conversations that you've had on Play to Potential. I personally have benefited quite a bit. I've enjoyed a lot of those conversations. Like I would keep WhatsApping you saying that, hey, I enjoyed this bit, I enjoyed that bit. Amazing stuff. Talk to us about Antarang. I'll double click on the podcasting and what it is for listeners and viewers, but I'm also curious about Antarang Foundation that you support and you talk about on your podcast. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Of course. I think let me provide a little bit of context how I got to meet them. When I left Egon Zehnder, I was also looking to see if I could do a little more on the social impact side. I didn't know what, but a part of me was saying, I've led a largely selfish life for a long time. Can I make a slight difference beyond me and my family and my near and dear ones? So one of my colleagues, again, Govind, my mentor, he was starting this chapter for an organization called Social Venture Partners. Now, they are a philanthropic organization based in Seattle. It's basically a group of philanthropists who want to make a difference. You pull in a small sum of money. Each one pays a certain annual check. You collect the corpus, and then you deploy the corpus almost like a venture capitalist. The only difference is that you curate the organizations, ensure that they're kosher and they have good teams and they're sort of well intended, but also they assemble teams to work with the organization to help them, scale up. So I was part of a team of 3. There's a gentleman called Vinay Hebar and there's a lady called Amita Chauhan. The 3 of us were part of the team that worked with the founder Priya Agarwal, the founder of Antarang Foundation, and her leadership team. And we sort of took different themes. Vinay would focus on strategy and tech. Amita would focus on fundraising and communication. I would focus on leadership and culture. Slowly, I sort of got to know their work. And Antarang, to put it very simply, works with children from challenged backgrounds, economically challenged backgrounds, and unlocks their potential. And it does that by providing them awareness around the future career pathways. And the whole idea is that there's a large informal sector, right? If you really look around, there's a lot of people who are stuck in that web of informal sector, whether it's laborers, whether it's people who are doing domestic work, etc., etc. So really, how do you really help these people break that cycle of informal sector, which has low economic potential?
Sure.
Right? So they do that by doing multiple things. One is building awareness. Second is giving them hope that continuing education makes sense. A lot of these people drop off the education. And then connect them with different mentors and gives them, there's also, one is sort of a skill. Second is also, there's a certain way in which you access the world of opportunity. Things that we take for granted, right? How do you write a CV? How do you communicate? How do you network? How do you meet people? How do you interview? There are multiple barriers that these people face. So that's what they do. Along the way, as I was sort of starting the podcast, I was looking for a couple of people that could help me with editing the podcast. At that time, I said, why don't I put money where mouth is? And I asked Priya if she could share the profiles of a couple of people who may not have the background, but have fire in the belly to learn and grow. So the 2 people who work with me come from that background.
Amazing.
So there's Akash Diore, who's my sort of social media manager, if you will. And there's Arman Bansod, who handles the audio editing. So they've been on my journey. And I, once again, just like my sounding board work, I see this as a journey with them over the long term. Hopefully, I can help them play to their potential.
No, how fascinating. And I also remember you talking very beautifully about while potential is abundant, creation of opportunity is also important. You know, everybody doesn't get the same starting line to begin with.
Yes.
And it's our job to, to create a more equitable world. There is that bit, that nudge that somebody is waiting out there that needs it.
And maybe just the only point I would add, Jay, is it's a problem at scale.
It is.
Right. There are millions of such people. Now, one of the questions that I sometimes get or I ask myself is, helping two people, is that enough when you've got millions? And I don't have a clean answer. It's just that when I look at myself, what gives me energy and what ensures that I can play the long game, I find that this gives me joy and I feel I can do this and I stay the course over the long run. But I have a lot of respect for people who are building organizations to scale, like Priya Agarwal, who's building Antarang, and several others. So I think what I tell people is, finally, we need to be true to who we are and what gives us joy, and within that, see what's the role we can play in the community space as we go on our journeys.
I can't even begin to tell you. While you're not begrudging other organizations and the way they add value, I would add that you're doing your bit in as harmonious and as authentic a manner as possible, and that's really appreciable. How can people contribute to this foundation? What can they do? How can they reach out? Money, time, energy. Is there where can they check them out? Is there something?
Thank you first of all for asking the question. I think they have a website, antarangfoundation.org. I'm sure the website has the links. I think the founder's email is priya@antarangfoundation.org. Or if they write to me, I'm happy to connect them with the right cause. So I think money, of course, fundraising is always a requirement. But I think there's all kinds of requirements. I'm not plugged into the latest and greatest in terms of their needs.
Sure.
But any well-intended help can only be beneficial, right? So reach out and we can figure out something.
Absolutely. Makes a lot of sense.
Sorry, since you ask, the one last point I might make to the point you made was create opportunities, bet on potential, right? I find that very often we look at CV and hire. But if many people could take the leap of faith and bet on potential, we will unlock many more lives.
Amazing.
Very often I find that people hesitate to take that leap of faith.
Gotcha.
It requires a little bit of patience. You need to work with them. They're like the diamonds in the rough, right? They may not be ready on day one. But as long as we are patient, very often there's ROI.
Great stuff. Deepak, one of the reasons that I was also very interested to get a fellow practitioner on this journey is because while we are on the path, there could be a danger that we are also in a bubble of sorts. And I thought it would be nice if we hear from voices that are usually not heard. And one of the pushbacks that I think might be in the minds of successful leaders or, just regular leaders is, why should I invest in going after leadership content today? Isn't leadership something that happens organically while I continue the work that I'm supposed to do? Any thoughts?
Good question, Jay. Don't have a clean answer, and my answer can be construed as being biased. Couple of thoughts. One is, I think we are living in a world where there's abundant content.
Absolutely.
Right? Clearly. But having said that, I feel there is still a role in contextual content. And let me tell you what I mean by that. For example, we have 2 children. When my wife was expecting our first child, we bought this book, What to Expect When You're Expecting. Right? I'm sure a lot of men and women would have heard this book. The reason I find that book fascinating is it was relevant for us exactly for 9 months or 8-9 months around that time. And maybe a little bit around the second child. And then it's lying on the bookshelf, but it's got no relevance for the rest of our lives. I find that content is, while there's an abundance in content, I think there is I'd like to place a premium on contextual content. For example,
nice.
In my podcast, I try and slice the conversation into various pieces and organize them by nuggets. One of the nuggets is settling into a new context, where I talk to leaders about how did they spend the first 3 months in a role. Now, whenever a new leader transitions and I get to know that they're transitioning context, I share them that playlist, which is curated stuff, which is almost like the equivalent of what to expect when you're expecting.
Wow.
What to expect when your changing context, right? And they find it of immense value. Now that piece of content has zero value 9 months earlier, 9 months later.
Sure.
So I think point number one I want to make is maybe I think there's an opportunity to see how can we make contextual content as we think about making content. Second is from a leader's perspective, I think there's also a lot of bumper sticker wisdom floating around.
Sure.
Right? If Alcaraz beats Djokovic next day, there are some 100 articles around resilience, about taking risks and whatever, right?
Sure.
Grass is greener on the other side, kind of, especially if it's Wimbledon and so on.
Yes.
So I think leaders probably need to place greater weightage on source credibility. I find that if you just consume the content that's coming in, it can lead to fatigue and it can lead to a little bit of cynicism. But I think there's still a few places out there which are emitting signal and not noise. Now, again, each leader has to figure out
what is signal, what is noise.
What is signal and what is noise. So I think the bar on figuring that out has gone up as well. I think that's a broader point about just the media exposure. But your earlier point about I'm practitioner, of course, there is learning by doing. But I think if somebody else has thought deeply about something, why not learn from other people's mistakes or other people's wisdom, right? So those are the 2-3 thoughts in that context.
No, amazing. So what happens is in the business of doing things, there are leaders who work by the clock and say there are only so many hours in a day, and that is to extract as much value as possible from me and from my team. And maybe it's a tad cynical point of interaction with that ecosystem, but taking the time out to invest in themselves is such a rarity these days. I'm still hopeful that there are a lot of people who will consume great content and think of wisdom and information as the way they consume their diet. You need proteins, you need carbs, you need a big mix and balance of everything. And all leadership wisdom doesn't have to be hoary and claim to cure cancer and we're very serious and kind of a thing. But innate curiosity is something that I took from you as well. Any tips on how leaders can spark curiosity? Because it's very easy to get caught up in the mundane. It's very easy to get caught up in the process. And it's very easy to get caught up dousing fires. To take the time out and to be curious about other disciplines, about spheres, to connect the dots is very, very relevant. Any tips on how they can take their first steps towards that?
I would say you're right. I think most leaders are overwhelmed. They're drinking from a fire hose. So I don't deny that. I would say back to the point about adjacent possible, right? I feel sometimes the journey begins at home, right? You can be curious about your spouse, how her day was, about your child, how their school day was, or about a topic. For example, my daughter is in grade 8. She's going to grade 8. And she's got something around the Second World War. Now, when I studied history, I never paid attention to it properly, right? It's just that it wasn't taught in a very intuitive way and my understanding of history is very limited. So I said, why don't I take advantage of what she's doing and spend some time with her, but also learn history along the way. So in a way, we watched some videos around the Second World War, what caused it, etc., etc. So I feel the one thought is adjacent possible. You don't have to go and read up about gardening or biophysics.
Sure.
Right? I think the answer might be closer than you think. It might be your colleague. Maybe it's about their life. Maybe it's about a pet. Maybe it's about their passion, about their hobby, or it's your child, or the person who who's a helper at your home. So I find if we can minimize friction, it just makes it easier. We don't have to go looking for it. It's around us. It's just about changing the way in which we engage with the ecosystem around us. That's the way I think about it.
I think it's such a harmonious way to start with it as well, right? Start with people around you, start with the environment around you. I still remember there was this writing workshop and that I'd attended, and everybody was writing, in New Jersey this was happening. When I was walking down Millard, this was happening. And the instructor very beautifully told us, look, write about where you are. Write about your next road. Write about your home. That's where you talk about the familiar and use the lens of an unfamiliar way to look at it and try to look at, try to talk and tell that story. And I think that was really interesting.
there was a lot of hashtag Black Lives Matter.
Yes.
And my response was, have you been to Dharavi?
Absolutely,
Correct.
right?
Correct.
And I also think that polite curiosity is such a beautiful part of the human condition, which, doesn't see or doesn't get the merit that it rightfully ought to get, because we all have our stories and everybody is brimming with stories. And if you're just curious in another person's journey, it opens up a world of possibilities for both partners in that particular journey, right?
I mean, if I go back to the COVID context, right? One of the things that one of my the person I was talking to asked me was about my background. That seems to be an interesting thing. And that got me talking, and it's sort of one thing led to another. So I think the opportunity exists. It might be the background that the person has. It might be a WhatsApp DP. Sometimes if somebody has a provocative picture of a mountain or a sea or a pet, I would start with that. I'm curious about why you have that. And that often elicits a name. If it's an entrepreneur, sometimes I ask them about how they thought about the brand. Why this name?
Yeah.
And sometimes that can elicit a story. So I think stories are everywhere. You just have to, if the listener is ready, the story appears, as they say.
But I hopefully, when I talk to leaders and their engagement with wrestling with content that doesn't jive with them, which alters their worldview, the familiar is very, very known. It's very safe. Getting comfortable with uncertainty, getting comfortable with aspects that they're not the smartest person in the room. Any tips on how this is going to look like, the world is going to look like, and what's the impact on leadership as we know today?
Now, clearly, many more people have done a lot of research on this, Jay. Mine is more of a practitioner's view and a little bit of a derived view. But recently I was talking in my podcast to a gentleman called Stephen M.R. Covey. He's a son of the legendary Stephen Covey, who wrote The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. So he talks about this book. He talks about the fact that the leadership paradigm is shifting, has already shifted or should shift from command and control to trust and inspire. Right? I find that historically in a world of certainty, command and control could work. You were often the smartest person in the room. But in a new paradigm, so much is outside the realm of what you know. Especially, I find this playing out when somebody transitions from a CXO role to a general management or a CEO role. When you're in your function, you're often the king or the queen of your domain.
Right.
But when you become the general manager, you happen to know only 10%. The rest 90% actually is a black box. You have an appreciation, but it's often, the pace of change is just so much, you're often clueless. So I think the only way to make that happen is to build trust, to give them, to empower them. Of course, have guardrails to see how you monitor them. But if you came from a place of, I know it, here's how it's done, you're just doing yourself, your organization, everybody around you a disservice, because what you know is a binding constraint on what you could become. So I think the other guest on my podcast was a gentleman called Ambi Parameswaran. He's a leading name in the ad agency circles. He uses the metaphor of architects and pillars. He says if you're building a home and the architect says we need 4 pillars here, you get 4 pillars. You don't tell the guy, I don't like that pillar, remove it. If the guy says there's a 4th pillar is required, take it, because there's wisdom behind that. So I think we need to move into an environment where we need to trust people. Of course, you need to ensure that you've got the right set of people that you can build trust with. But once you've crossed that bridge, I think the more we lean into their wisdom, the better off all of us are. I think the last example I would give, which again I learned in my podcast, is I spoke to a gentleman called Vinay Sitapati, who's written the book Half Line about Narasimha Rao's life. And he talks about how Narasimha Rao assembled his team, including Manmohan Singh. And they were accountable for pushing through the economic reforms of 91, which is commendable, right? If 100%. You really look at, again, I don't have strong political leanings. So this is not about that.
Likewise.
But the idea is how do you really push through change where your domain expertise is only limited. Your job is to bring in an orchestra and conduct that orchestra. So I think it's a lot more about being a great conductor than being a great instrument player. And that requires a certain set of muscles which sometimes people are not born with. That requires deliberate practice, especially in an Indian context because of scarcity. A lot of us are used to sort of pushing forward because that's the only way you could escape a certain orbit. But that starts derailing you after a certain point in time. You need to sort of be the last person to get into the elevator. So that's a journey that I see a lot of CXOs grappling with.
Very, very beautifully put. Another paradox, if I may call it that, or my observation, leaders make inspiring teams. Teams make organizations what they are. An organization is nothing. It's a shell without investing in its people. Of late, there are a slew of organizations, especially when tech is turning out to be the secret elixir behind a company's success. And there have been a rash of organizations which are saying organization culture will evolve organically. We don't need to do anything about it, but I will protect my tech. And I will encourage disagreeableness. I will encourage toe treading. That's almost becoming symbolic. I mean, I was listening to a startup founder talk about 3 panic attacks that he's had in the last 3 months or, whatever. He's getting better, but talking about panic attacks, and there is a sense of glorification of the hustle culture. What is the face of leadership in these times? When tech suddenly seems to be like, I remove tech from you, you're nothing. Your organization is nothing. People come, people go. They're fairly replaceable. While it's nice to be glib while it's nice to say the right thing and say, yes, people are our secret sauce and they are the ones who help us differentiate our brand in the marketplace. Proprietary practices, tech, processes, are they becoming more important now?
The way I see it, Jay, I don't see it as an either or. Right? The point is, I feel that's a false dichotomy. Clearly, of course, in some businesses, tech is the sort of the key value engine. But I do think there's a role of leadership. And I think the question to ask is, are we building to last? Or are we building to sort of sell to the next investor and move on in life? And I find that if you're building to last, it requires a very different mindset. One of the people I spoke to in the podcast once again was a gentleman called Tarun Khanna. He's a professor at Harvard Business School, and he's written a book with his colleague Jeffrey Jones called Leadership to Last, where he's spoken to entrepreneurs in emerging markets about entrepreneurs who've built institutions that have lasted decades, right, if not centuries. So I asked him, what is it about the leadership of these entrepreneurs that have built to last? And he said 3 things. He said, I might mix up the words a little bit, but broadly, the 3 things he said was audacity of intent. They need to have the fire in the belly. Second is, he said, humility of demeanor. They need to be grounded in the way they treat people. And third, he said, was steadfastness of purpose.
Lovely.
They need to have the why very clear. Now, I find there's a lot of audacity of intent.
Gotcha.
But 2 and 3, I find is a hit or a miss. Now, you might build. How long it lasts is the question, right? We're already seeing, an EdTech unicorn going through its. That's a classic example of course, great product. But if the values are not in place, the purpose is not clear. If there's toxicity in the system, I find that it catches up one day or the other.
At some point or the other.
At some point or the other. Now, the question is, you might look at a 2-year window and say, this guy's got this valuation, and you might celebrate it. But if you apply the lens of leading to sort of leadership to last, then I think a different set of companies and a different set of leadership practices will emerge. I'm working with another Sequoia-funded company in Bangalore, where the 2 co-founders, extremely humble, extremely understated, and they have very limited attrition when they look at the team. They're doing well. Now, they might take 6 months extra, but I can see that they're building to last. So I think these are choices. Are you building for health or are you building for performance?
Deepak, as a part of this series of conversations, the idea is to learn as much as possible from other practitioners and pass on that wisdom to leaders. What would be some of the best aspects from your practice that CXOs can learn from?
What I do on a daily basis?
Yeah.
What others can learn from, I don't know. But I think a few things that have helped me, I feel, is I think one is genuinely, I believe the more time I spend doing this work, I think self-awareness has become more and more important. So just trying to carve out some time to just reflect, both in terms of internal self-awareness, but also gather proactive feedback. I find that it's changed my life. Some of the outside-in feedback, but also my tuning into what gives me energy. There's an old Tamil song. Can I share?
Of course.
There's an old MGR Tamil song,
Wow.
which says, "Unnai arindal ni unnai arindal ulagathil poradalam. Uyarndalum tarndalum thalai vanangamal ni vaadalam." Which basically means if you know yourself, you can fight all the battles. So, but know yourself. Kannadasan was a great lyricist. So it's one of the many songs. So I think one, I feel walking this path of self-awareness has made a big difference to me. It's still a journey. It's work in progress, but I think that's made a difference. Second thing I feel is, I think you used the word harmonious some time back. I think that's a word that means a lot to me. I find that we all have finite time. And the more we can harmonize across work, home, community, and everything else, I think it just sort of ensures that we use the time most judiciously, right? The example, if I may share, is I tore a ligament while playing tennis in 2010. And then when I was recovering, I wanted to do something to prove to myself that I'm fit. I went through a ACL reconstruction surgery and so on. I ran a 7K around the Mumbai Marathon. That went okay. Then I started training for a half marathon with a running group called Striders. So I had to raise funds for a not-for-profit. So raise funds for a company called Salam Bombay Foundation, which is about anti-tobacco behavior in kids. I said, why don't I galvanize a group of people around the office, and I got them along. And eventually I ended up raising quite a bit of funds. I was, I think, the second or third in their list of fundraisers. And their brand ambassador was a guy called Shan. So they said the top 2-3 people can come to Shan's studio and record 2-3 songs. So me, my wife, my sister, my daughter. So my wife, my sister and I, we recorded this song, It's the Time to Disco.
Oh,
with
cute.
Shan singing his pieces and we singing our pieces. So in his studio in Bandra. That was lovely. It was
amazing.
And my daughter and I recorded the song Edelweiss from The Sound of Music, where I played the guitar and she sang. She must have been 1.5 or 2. So I think that I feel I could bring my passion, I could bring my work, I could do a little bit of community service, I could work on my fitness. I felt by doing that one thing, I could tick multiple boxes. So I at least urge the people I work with to see if you can pursue things in a way that you're not doing different things to tick different boxes. Can you find a harmonious way of ticking multiple boxes by doing fewer things, given time is of the essence? So that's something that I sort of actively look out for. I mean, something I learned from a gentleman called Stu Friedman of Wharton, who was on my podcast. He talks about 3-way wins or 4-way wins, where you try to win across self, work, home, and community. When I say win, you sort of take care of multiple things. So for example, even on the guitar, we were speaking about it some time back. I used to sit in a room and practice the tunes that my teacher taught me. Then I said, why don't I learn the songs that my kids like to sing? Mm-hmm. And I started learning, some of the lead pieces, rhythm pieces. And then it's fun for the family. And one of my memories of COVID is recording songs with the kids and, sort of building those memories. So that's something that I try and practice if I could be harmonious across the different things I do. The third I would say is I try and minimize context switching. I think what I realize is with just multiple things pinging for your attention, just the ability to do concentrated work is just so limited. So I try and keep my phone in a different room if I'm trying to do something for a period of time, deep work. And if I'm doing something, then I try and bunch up activities. For example, if I have to pay bills. Mm-hmm. I was watching Wimbledon with my daughter 2 days back, Alcaraz and Djokovic. Yep. So I said I can pay taxes on the side. It's sort of low cognitive effort. So I find I'm at my best in the mornings. So I try and protect my attention in the mornings very fiercely. Beautiful. Try not to calendar calls. Try not to have my device. So a few things. It's work in progress, but those are the few things.
No, almost athlete-like.
No.
Amazing. No, this is great. So I keep observing that different people have different triggers, mechanisms, processes for behavioral change. Any insight into the way you operate and you approach a new behavior? And if you can take us through something that you feel that has worked for you.
I would say I'll go back to the COVID days, right? There was a phase where I was in back-to-back calls. And, there used to be, I use the term psychological spillover. If I've had a bad call with a client, that would spill over in terms of irritation with my son or my wife or my daughter. And I think that was sort of in a way, and that was setting off a chain reaction. It's sort of, everybody's fully stretched.
Gotcha.
And that impacts my next call here. So one is I started baking in a little bit of buffer between calls so that I have time to gather myself, decompress, center myself. The second I feel is this tuning into feedback. I find that my son shows the mirror every now and then saying, "Appa, you seem irritable."
Wow.
Appa, I don't like, you seem to be twitching your nose. So he's got these 2-3 markers of irritability.
Nice.
And he say, you're sort of making that face. I don't like that face. So I think the feedback exists. I think I've sort of started tuning into a little bit more. And I think I also, you might have come across this term hanger, right? I realize that when I'm hungry, when I'm hungry, I get irritable. So very often my wife is quick to point out, I think you need a snack. I think you need a glass of water or a coffee or whatever. I think sometimes just trying to figure out, trying to have some sort of a feedback loop and some buffer to center yourself, I feel in that instance has helped me. I think it's contextual, but I think those are the 2-3 things I think about.
Nice. I'm more curious about your, when I said athlete, I wasn't saying it lightly, be it a fitness routine, physical, mental. Mental health awareness has come into the fore in the last 10 years. It's been around for a long time, but it's really caught on in the last 10 years. And for today's CXO, when time and money are two essential aspects that one keeps juggling and planning for, we not taking the time out to work on oneself physically and mentally is not a great recipe for success if it's only financial. What are your habits that you would like to pass on, where you've seen rewards for yourself?
It's work in progress, Jay.
100%.
The one I would
all
say,
of us are.
Yeah. The one I would say is, I think, if I use a metaphor from New York, right? I think life resembles used to feel like Central Park. Now it feels like Times Square. There's just so much bling out there, right? I think the peace and quiet is gone. There's a lot of devices. Everything is screaming for attention. There's a lot of noise. There's a lot of distraction. So I think it's easy to be calm in a Central Park, but I think when you're sort of overstimulated, so I think just finding time to finding sort of de-stimulize, if you will. Amazing. I think I find that helpful. Whether it's a run, I used to listen to music during runs. Now I've stopped.
Stopped that as well.
Stopped
Amazing.
that. So I think it's just I realized that I think there are many more things that are coming in the way of us connecting with ourselves. And I think we need to ensure that we don't lose that channel. So for example, that listening to music was one such channel I was realizing.
Sure.
So I said, let me sort of take that out and let me at least see what goes on in that washing machine when I'm running, right?
What an apt analogy. I love it.
Correct. So that's one. I would say find opportunities to de-stimulize is one. Second is, I think I used to do a lot of cardio at some point. Then I went for a couple of games of tennis and my shoulder packed up. I had a rotator cuff injury. Then I realized that I had to also have some strength training. Again, that's something that I'm beginning to bring back in my life. So I have a trainer and I spend some time with him. And I do a little bit of cardio on the side. So that's the second thing. And I think on the mental health side, I think that's what some of my clients tell me, having a sounding board. Very often people are also lonely in their journeys. I remember reading an article some time back where in Japan, it's a fascinating country. There are a bunch of professionals who just, for lack of I don't know the right term, they are cuddlers.
Oh yeah, professional cuddlers, yeah.
Yeah, so people are so lonely that they pay for somebody to come and just cuddle and be next to you as you take rest. So some of the leaders I work with, they say, I mean, it's lonely at the top, but I think it's gotten lonelier at the top with devices and some of these things. So so 2-3 thoughts on that context. Yeah.
No, excellent.
Get a sounding board, or get somebody you talk to, right? I think is the last point.
Deepak, a last question before we wind up. Are there any books or movies that you've been inspired by to draw greater meaning for your own life and also to have a positive impact on people around you?
Many. So I would let me start with movies. I think books a lot of people talk about. Movies
Sure.
sometimes. I think one of my guests actually said, good content is like a homeopathy pill. It's sweet on the outside, but the medicine acts on you, right? You don't
Gotcha.
realize that you're
Yeah.
consuming medicine.
Yeah.
You feel like you're eating chocolate. We were talking about Goodwill Hunting some time back. I saw it, I think it was my second year in IIM Ahmedabad. One of my seniors, a gentleman called Vijay Sarthi, he was a PhD, he was an FPM student. He said, DJ, I think you'll like it, watch it. So I think he was, I didn't watch it at that time, I watched it a few years later, but then I realized why he might have said that. So I think that movie, in a way, that Robin Williams character shaped me in a lot of ways, you know. So I think that's one movie that's very close to heart. The other movie that left a mark on me is the movie Anand in Hindi, where Rajesh Khanna has a cancer condition, and just
Full-on confession on screen, I can still cry.
yeah, it's just
I watched that movie.
yeah, it's just a movie which puts life in perspective and the fact that we all have a choice. That's the second movie. I would say the third movie is Martian. You might now notice that there's a there's a Matt Damon
slight
thread.
Matt Damon bias.
And the reason I like the movie is the last quote. You know, he sort of comes back to earth, etc., etc., and he says, "The only way to move forward is to solve one problem at a time. That's the only way you solve problems. That's the only way you come home." And to me, I found that as a beautiful synthesis of approach to life. You know, there are many messy things. You just keep solving them one at a time, and you move forward. There's no magic. There's no one magic solution to everything, but it's just taking the one hurdle and solving it one at a time. So those three movies come to mind. I find songs as inspiration as well. You didn't ask me
Lovely.
about songs,
Lovely.
but I like my daughter also, I think, pays a lot of attention to words. And I really like, for example, one song that inspires me is the song Besabriyan from the movie MS Dhoni. And there are some words there which says, Kya ye ujale, kya ye andhere, दोनों के आगे मंजर तेरे, क्यों रोशनी तू बाहर तलाशे, तेरी मशाले अंदर तेरे.
Oh, wow.
The point being, why are we looking for cues outside? The answer is within. So some songs really inspire me. I spoke about this Unnai Arindal song by MGR. So which other? If I talk about books, I think the one book that really made a mark on me is this book Working Identity by this lady called Herminia Ibarra of
And
London.
she's been on your show
my
as well, yeah.
podcast. And I think that really shaped a lot of my thinking, saying, we seem to be very fixated about identity.
Wow.
I'm this CEO, I'm this investor, I'm this, I'm that. But if we can sort of play with our identity, then I think we could become much more than what we are today. So those are 2-3 sources of inspiration.
Beautiful. This actually reminds me, this solve one problem at a time. I was just talking to somebody who's in climate tech, and I said, well, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. And then he came up with another quick. For all the vegans out there, that elephant was made of soy. Deepak, on that note, thank you so much for your time and for sticking around. And I enjoyed this conversation. I hope our leaders, our viewers definitely consume this content, and I hope it gets them some bit of wisdom on their way to work. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jay. Thanks for having me.